It's great to be here. I've been living here, and now it's great to sort of share a bit about the project with you. Again, apologies for being late, but it's, what is it? Today's Thursday, Saturday's the opening, so things are intense. But we did have a great run through today, so that was very good. It's true what Alice said. There's a piece of mine called Anthem. It's a very simple choral piece. It's for one voice, a cappella singing. And since, I think, 3 years now or so, it's become kind of a tradition. It's also a way I get out of doing sort of speeches at the opening that we sing this piece. I sing this piece together with everyone who's in the show, the performers, but also with everyone who's helped make the show. And that includes everyone working in the institution, members of the board, basically everyone who's part of the family. And it's a great moment. Everyone says, oh, I can't sing, I don't want to sing, I'm embarrassed to sing. But actually, it's once we do it, then they say, when can we do it again? So for those of you who are part of that, it would be great to see you at the opening and to sing together at the opening. So this is a prepared talk on the Kunsthalle for music, just so I've adjusted it a bit. Some of it is a little bit technical, but I think maybe it's a half hour, and so there's also time afterwards for questions and things. So I'm just going to sort of jump in, and like I said, afterwards we can have some questions and hopefully like a little conversation. So I'm Ari Benjamin Meyers, and I'm speaking to you tonight as the founder and artistic director of the Kunsthalle for music. Some of you have heard of it, some of you may be hearing about it now for the first time. In any case, I hope all of you will experience it this Saturday night at the opening and in the coming 6 weeks of the exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Santa Barbara. And I want to, in this talk, give a short introduction to the Kunsthalle for music, describe a bit of its history, how it came into being, and perhaps more importantly, why it came into being. The Kunsthalle for music is a proposition for a new institution. As such, it is right now, as always, the process of becoming, existing momentarily and nomadically, seeking some kind of permanence, but perhaps also never existing. Therefore, for me, it's quite exciting to be able to talk to you about it now, not as a fait accompli, but as another moment of the institution instantiating itself. As I mentioned, it is a nomadic institution, and since its inception about a year and a half ago, it's made stops in Hong Kong, Rotterdam, and Moscow before coming here to Santa Barbara. And next year we'll travel to Berlin. And I would just like to note that this act of constantly, continuously becoming, that this process itself is a fundamentally musical one. So let me start at the beginning with the first manifestation, the inaugural exhibition of the Kunsthalle for music, which took place at Witte in Rotterdam and ran for 6 weeks. The show essentially consisted of 3 components, and these would be the ensemble of musician performers who enacted the show every day it was open, the repertoire they performed, and a series of 4 commissions that were newly created by 4 artists working directly with the ensemble institute at Witte. So let me just talk briefly about each one of these components because they all play a part in this show that we're doing here. In Rotterdam, the ensemble consisted of 8 musician performers. And in fact, they were not all professional musicians, but a mix of professionally trained musicians with different backgrounds, side by side with artists, dancers, and performers who have a strong musical element in their practice and or background, but can best be described musically as amateurs. This is perhaps one of the biggest taboos that show broke, certainly from the music side, the mixing of professional, trained musicians and musical amateurs. And because an important aspect of the Kunsthalle's mission is about questioning and basically removing the veil of perfection and preciousness that surrounds contemporary music performance, this was a necessary step. The instrumentation consisted of piano, cello, violin, saxophone, electric guitar, drums, and we also used voice and electronics. The ensemble was chosen in a long casting process that took many months, and the final ensemble was only put together after a series of group workshops where different configurations were tried out. For the coming show, I mentioned in Berlin, we're going to work with this same ensemble again. For the show here, we created a new local ensemble from scratch. And likewise, it also was a process that took many months. It was very intense. So for Kunsthalle for Music, I created something called the Songbook. And this contains all the repertoire for the show that the ensemble plays. By repertoire, I mean here existing musical works by composers, musicians, and visual artists, chosen by me and contributed to the Kunsthalle, that we either took as they were or adapted in some way. These works came in many different forms, not just as classically notated scores, but as instructions, diagrams, texts, etc. I won't list all the participants now, but just mention that it includes contemporary composers such as Paulina Oliveros and Julius Eastman, who are sadly both deceased, but it also has younger composers such as Wojtek Blechacz and Leah Letzel. And from the visual art side, we have musical works by artists such as Yoko Ono, Christian Marclay, Ari Sala, Hassan Khan, Sung Wan Kim, and Superflex, just to give an example. For this iteration in Santa Barbara, new works have been added, including pieces by local composers and from the ensemble members themselves. The final component of the exhibition were 4 commissions. These were done by the composer Jonathan Bepler. You might know him through the music he did for Matthew Marty's Cremaster films. The artist duo Olivia Castro and Oliver Olafson, by the US art rock band The Residents, who are almost locals in San Francisco, and the artist Dominique Gonzalez Foster. The commissions by Jonathan Bepler, Dominique Gonzalez Foster, and The Residents are now part of the Kunsthalle for Music repertoire and can be experienced as part of the show, the upcoming show here in Santa Barbara. I would like to point out that the original realization of these commissions took place as part of the running show. In other words, the work between artist and ensemble rehearsals. These all took place publicly during the regular opening hours. And I would say that this highlights another very important aspect of Kunsthalle for Music, the breakdown between performance and rehearsal. Or rather, an emphasis on the process of music making in its entirety, as opposed to the limited and incomplete idea of a music performance existing only in a final and unchanging state, i.e. as a concert or a recording. So now that I've described a bit the content, and before I go further, let me just go backwards a minute and briefly trace the history of how this first manifestation came into being, and a few important stations that led up to it. The first time I used the phrase Kunsthalle for Music in print was in an extended interview with the art historian Marie-France Raphael, that later became the book Music on Display. This is what I said there. I'll just read it, quote, "In today's classical concerts, there's very little room for this, for the unrehearsed, the so-called extraneous or the contingency, even, or one can say especially, within contemporary music performance practice. We need the Philharmonie, or La Scala, in all its perfection, like we need museums to display the old masters. But we also need another kind of space for contemporary music performance that hasn't really existed until now. Let's call it a Kunsthalle for Music. We as composers and musicians haven't traditionally had this playground as we know it in contemporary art. As a composer, I feel a strong pull towards a non-goal-oriented musical space through the reef. An art space has, of course, its own rules, but it's still a space you can navigate at your own pace. And it was this book and this sentence that Daphne Ayers read, and that eventually led to the invitation of Witte de Witte. Daphne Ayers, as some of you know, is a curator, but at that time was director of Witte de Witte. She got in touch and basically asked me flat out, would I like to realize this Kunsthalle for Music? One rarely gets phone calls like this. At least I rarely get phone calls like that. And so I said, yes I would. Actually, in preparing to write this talk, I looked it up and I found the email where she asked, so what does a Kunsthalle look like? It was around 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago, just to get a sense of how long these things take. And about 6 months after that, in November 2016, I released via eFlux. And eFlux is kind of like for those of you, maybe some of you know it, but it's like a newsletter for contemporary art. I released via eFlux the Kunsthalle for Music Manifesto. And I'm just going to read it for you. now. So it starts this way: music is not necessarily what you think it is. Can we imagine a space for music that exists outside of any media and beyond the stage? A space for unrecordable music, music of undefined duration, existing even when no audience is present. A dissolution of performer and audience, of rehearsal and performance. A music existing in the world, based in a space of musical action and activity, production and performance that can be entered into and exited from at will. A space where the ideal listening and viewing position is determined independently by each artist, performer, or visitor, not determined beforehand by a seat number on a ticket. Having an ensemble at the center of its activity, carrying out or otherwise enacting the work, which continues during opening hours when there are visitors present or not. So this was the first part of the manifesto. Basically, it's an outline of some of the formal conditions of this envisioned institution, conditions that would practically work towards a new framework for the composition, presentation, and perception of music, and at the same time potentially trigger some reflection about the rules and conventions that prevail in the concert hall on the one hand, and the ways music is present in the white cube on the other. The manifesto continues, quote, "Music today is encountered primarily as that which we consume, through a remove, usually neatly prepackaged, either as a recording or on a stage. And yet throughout most of its history, to experience music, one had to perform it. Music was, by definition, live, social, and spatial. In other words, also messy, political, metatemporal. Music was not merely in space, it was space. Music was not only social through listening, it was social in its conception. Music didn't happen in time, it defined time. Music is not necessarily what you think it is." Here, it was important for me to stress the great extent to which music has fundamentally changed from what it had been since inception until about roughly 90 years ago, with the advance in recording technologies and amplification, as well as the rise of commercially available recordings in home radio and later home stereo systems. This extreme shift from an exclusively live form to a predominantly mediated one cannot be overemphasized. The manifesto goes on, "Music is inherently not about perfection or reproducibility. Music is the act of the orchestra rehearsing. Music is John Baldassare sings solo Witte. Music is a group of people becoming a choir or a band, whether they perform publicly or not. Music is two strangers singing a duet. In short, how can we imagine contemporary music, composition, and music performance as contemporary art today? When did we forget that music, compositional strategies, formal structures, harmony and dissonance, orchestration, scoring, arrangement, rhythm, tempo, is at the base of it all? Music traditionally had been a driver of the contemporary, all the more striking than the situation where while music has mostly separated itself and been separated from what is considered to be contemporary art. It is in this schism that Kunsthalle for music operates. And in fact, John Baldassare sings solo Witte later became one of the central repertoire pieces in the show. This schism that I mentioned, I will talk more about this a little later. The manifesto concludes, so what in this sense would be the institution for music inside and alongside the contemporary art institution? What would be its repertoire? What kind of a school and educational attitudes would it have at its heart? How would it contemplate the state of musicians and music today? How should it relate to the musical and visual avant-gardes of the past that strive for symbiosis of sound and image, music and concept? Would its ensemble include musicians and non-musicians alike? Would it have a collection? That's a slightly different version, sorry about that. But would it have a collection? If so, how would Music Works enter into the market in the first place? What kind of a mythical new audience would it design? That's it. So in a way, it's rather a soft manifesto in that it's not dictating anything, but it's rather asking a series of questions. And of course, I wanted to try to answer these questions. So this manifesto, the questions and issues it raised, led directly to the next step, which was a symposium that we held at Witte, which took place May 25th and 26th in 2017, called Music is Not, a symposium on and around Kunsthalle for music. The title, taken from the first sentence of the manifesto, is intended as a kind of positive, productive negation. At the symposium, we brought together artists, composers, curators, philosophers, and theoreticians to discuss the proposition for the Kunsthalle for music. Among them was Peter Osborne. He may be known to some of you here. He's director for the Center for Research in Modern European Philosophy at Kingston University, and wrote, among others, the book, very important book, Anywhere or Not at All, Philosophy of Contemporary Art. In his keynote talk, he focused very much on this idea of negation addressed in the title of the symposium, and he gave an analysis of this negation as attempted by the project of Kunsthalle for music. He outlined 3 possible forms of negation in relation to music that I would quickly like to summarize here. I'll start, as he did, with the third one, the third negation. Music is not, he said, might be misunderstood as, quote, the negation of music as such, not merely in its historically developed forms, but in principle in all its conceivable forms. So this third negation, for obvious reasons, has to be taken out of the equation because it quite literally leads us nowhere. It's completely nihilistic. It's a total dead end. It basically means the complete and total negation of all music in all time. That doesn't really help us very much. But going back to the first negation, which was, quote, the negation of what music currently is, via the negation of one or more of what are taken to be its currently essential predicates. Now this is essentially the negation strategy that has produced what we call contemporary music. In other words, negating through alternative compositional strategies one or more aspects of music and or music making that were at one time or another in the past deemed as essential to understanding something as being music in the first place. So for example, atonality, or later indeterminacy. The failure, as I believe Peter Osborne sees it, and I confess I see it the same way, of contemporary music to be truly contemporary lies precisely with this piecemeal approach to negation. For example, it certainly is a paradox of some kind that even the most radically atonal and complex music is still performed in a concert setting that has changed little over the last 100 years. In other words, the institutional framework was left intact, and so was its function as a determining factor in keeping up with a particular idea of music writ large. Which leads me directly to Osborne's second idea of negation in regard with the title of the symposium. Second musical negation, it's this one that is of particular interest as it pertains to Kunsthalle music. Music is not, Osborne went on, could be more correctly interpreted as, quote, the negation of music as a whole in its historically developed totality as it is currently understood. In other words, neither a complete negation of all music nor a selective adjustment of particular compositional strategies, but in fact, a reframing, a total reframing that includes not only the sound of the music, but its presentation, its institutions, its educational systems, and production models. This is the reframing that Kunsthalle for music is attempting, and one critical element of this attempt has been to reframe this whole within the context of what we think of as contemporary art. But now you may ask yourself why. Why not approach this negation within the field of music itself? Why a Kunsthalle for music? Kunsthalle being, of course, a German word that literally means art hall. Kind of made it to English somewhat, but it's just kind of Germanic Anglo title, Kunsthalle for music. There are, of course, multiple answers to this question, each with its own trajectory. On one level, it's an extremely personal project that comes directly out of my own biography. In the manifesto, it states that the Kunsthalle operates within a schism, and I would say that I myself have 2 large schisms in my background, that much of my work has been about or around that. The first one is not so unique. It involves reconciling the music that I study, first as a pianist and a composer, later a conductor. This would be, of course, what we call Western classical and contemporary music, serious music, quote-unquote serious music, reconciling that with the music that couldn't be studied, music of the moment, rock music, experimental music, etc. At a moment now where it seems that almost every young composer has his or her own band, and when only last year Kendrick Lamar's Damn won the Pulitzer Prize for music, this division may seem somewhat antiquated, and happily, in many ways it is. On the other hand, if you go online and see the reaction to Kendrick Lamar winning the Pulitzer Prize, you can see that this battle is not in any way over. But particularly at the time that I was studying music and composition in the 90s, this divide divide was extremely entrenched. This first schism and attempts at reconciliation, I would say, were the strongest influences on my work. In the first 15 years or so, I was working professionally as a composer. The second schism is the one that leads more directly to the Kunsthalle for music, the schism between contemporary music and contemporary art. I'd like to describe two fundamental moments that brought me to that and to the context of contemporary art. The first is quite organic and stems directly out of the direction my work and compositions were taking starting a little more than 10 years ago. A prime example from that time is a work of mine called Solo. The idea behind Solo was actually quite simple. It's a composition for an opera singer performing for one audience member in a small room. The whole piece takes about 15 minutes. It's written out in a normal way, and the score contains instructions for the singer involving her choreography and position in the room. Her relationship to the single audience member is integral to the piece, to the composition of the piece. It cannot be performed in any other way. And so, as you might imagine, it was very difficult, in the end, impossible, to have this work performed in any of the standard venues or opera houses. This is, of course, because the economics of music making, any kind of music making, whether it be pop, jazz, classical, is quantity-based, i.e. selling the maximum number of tickets or records or downloads to the maximum number of people. So of course I had a problem with Solo. But interestingly, around this time, I had one of the first possibilities to show a work in a gallery setting, and it was a revelation to see that in that setting there was absolutely no problem with the setup of Solo. In an art context, it was simply a performative installation for one audience member at a time. It was performed in a loop, people waited their turn, and it worked perfectly. That was a very important object lesson for me moving forward. The second key moment for me that happened around the same time was being invited to become the music director and composer for the group show Il Tempo del Destino. This was a group show curated by Hansel Obrist, who some of you may know the name, and Philippe Correno, a French artist. And it involved 15 artists creating short works for the opera stage and employing all the means that the opera house has to offer: orchestra, set design, costumes, etc. So essentially it was a group show of visual artists presented as a kind of bizarre opera in many parts over the course of 3 hours or so. The preparation and work with these artists on the scores and the pieces and the music was for me something like art school, because I of course never went to art school, I went to music school. And this is also where I worked with many of the artists for the first time, with whom I would later continue to collaborate, like Tino Segal, with whom I had already worked previously, and we even worked together when he was still a dancer, but also artists such as Henri Sala and Dominique Gonzalez-Foster. And so where this was a show about bringing artists to the opera stage, I started thinking with that about bringing music to the art context, to the white cube. And now that I've mentioned the white cube, which for many visual artists is the proverbial elephant in the room, or rather the elephant that is the room, but coming from the performing arts, the white cube is for me nothing more or less than an empty space, where I can literally do whatever I want. Of course, the white cube finds itself within certain institutions like the gallery, the museum, the public collection, etc. And it's precisely because of certain artists who have pushed, expanded, and even rejected notions of these institutions that there is this freedom today. These artists and works and gestures have come in waves over the last 60 years or so and fall under the heading of institutional critique. In comparison, music has not had its institutional critique moment. It simply takes place where it always takes place, in concert halls. There's certainly been a lot of complaining about it and some fiddling with the format of presentation, but these adjustments tend to be minor and mostly aesthetic. There's been no fundamental artistic movement in music that would systematically analyze and criticize the conditions that govern the production, presentation, and perception of music as artistic work. And so this was a central aspect to me in the creation of Kunsthalle for Music, the creation of a new institution as a critique of the existing institutions on both the music and the art side. To the extent that it is not a neat fit, and I can tell you it is not, and so can Abba say, fissures and cracks are created in the existing structures and institutions. And I think these small breaks in so to speak, fundament of the institutions, I think this is a very small but very necessary first step. So what I've tried to do here is give a very brief outline of the background and history of Kunsthalle for music, describe how it functions, and provide some theoretical reasons for its coming into existence. Having done that, I would show a short video. Is that, yeah? Like a very short, consider, we don't have one yet from this show, but like a trailer.
We actually have one from this show.
Do we?
Is it available to
Can we play it?
I have it in the Dropbox. Yep. Go ahead and show this one.
I'll show, maybe we can show both, we have time, no? And anyway, it's very interesting to see how different than these shows are. So here's like a short, this is from the original Witte.